Hey everybody, how's it going? Another day in the power saw shop. What are we doing here today? Well, I got a lot of questions about 038 Magnum Stihl versus 272. We all have our favorite. We all may be a little brand loyal, but some of you have said those two saws are the same, but they run so different. And I agree, friends. I find it very interesting how differently. I've owned both. I like the 038 Magnum better in the wood, pulling a long bar. For a short bar, I like the 272. It's lighter, it flicks around better, it's got better anti-vibe, but the 038 brings more grunt to the table. Now, the interesting thing, both these saws are 34 millimeter stroke, 52 millimeter bore, 72 cc's. They displace the same, but they couldn't run any different. Those of you that have had both have been messaging me and saying, saws are different. I wonder why. Well, I wonder why too, friends. So I have a 272 top end and an 038 Magnum top end. Let's look inside them. Let's look at the porting, combustion chambers, and everything else, and pistons, carburetors. Let's look at the differences and the similarities. Maybe they're more different than they are the same. These 272s tend to be zippier. They are a better saw for smaller wood, soft wood. They're more flickable. They will pull a long bar, but I think, in my opinion, an 038 Magnum will pull a long bar better. So the question is why? Is it porting? Is it carburetors, or is it the pistons? You can learn a lot from two strokes by studying how they run stock and looking at the differences. What makes a saw different than another saw? Now, I've timed many 272s. This 038 Magnum we timed on the last video. So this 038 Magnum has a higher exhaust roof than most 272s that I timed. That should make it a higher RPM saw, but it doesn't seem to be, which kind of throws off what we know about exhaust roofs. A higher exhaust roof will generally make more RPM. A lower exhaust roof, meaning it opens lower in the stroke, will make more torque. 272's time around 102 after top dead center. This one times at 100 after top dead center, and that's with a base gasket. So if it's not the exhaust roof height, what's the difference? Let's flip these over and study the porting. We know that a 272 has a couple degrees more intake timing, usually like 4 to 6 more degrees duration. That alone should feed it more fuel and air at higher RPM, meaning it will maintain a higher RPM because it's got more fuel and air. This saw timed around 70 after bottom dead center. That's 140 degrees of duration. That's pretty lazy for intake timing. These are generally a little snappier. These are gruntier. So let's flip both top ends over and let's look at the porting and the combustion chamber. I think I know why the 038 chugs better. It'll pull a long bar better, at least the ones I have run do, than a 272. But a 272 is a zippier saw. Let's look at why. Okay, we got both saws on the bench. So let's study the 038 Magnum. Let's look on the intake side. This intake is very blocked off, if you guys notice. Okay, it is offset to the right. The air flows in. Okay, so I would take a guess that this transfer gets fed more than this one. Okay, and there's a look on the inside. So, right away out of the box, the 038 Magnum, I'll use my Wolf Creek pen here to point it out. The 038 Magnum has a little bit of a design issue. That air's got to come around this corner, okay? It's nice when an intake is symmetrical, okay? I like this shape. I find that this shape in an intake will direct the air into the transfers better. See what we got going on there? It comes around the center and feeds that. I have a feeling that this shape probably takes care of some of this. We don't know though, right? So, interesting. So right away, when I port this, I think I'm going to try and flow this side a little bit. Okay, get the air going better into the left transfer. Okay, so there's your 038 intake. Let's look at the 272. Also has an interesting design. It's got this bump here. Okay, and it is offset to the right also. So, not as much as the 038. But similar, right? It is offset. So again, the air comes in here. This transfer gets fed quite nicely. This one might have a little bit of a harder time. Now we can't completely cut this out because that's where the carburetor bolt goes through. But we can definitely smooth that. Okay? So look at the difference in the intake shape. This one's taller. This one's skinnier. Now the funny thing is, this saw has more intake timing than this saw. Because realistically, that kind of throws it off. But believe it or not, this saw has longer intake duration than this saw, which means it's going to get more air. But this one has a bigger intake, so it might flow a little bit better. Interesting, isn't it? Now, let's look at our transfers. Standard, late 70s through the 80s into the early 90s. Most pro saws look like this. You get a lower transfer, flows into here. Sometimes these open at this corner first. These ones appear to be fairly flat. It might be slightly tipped up. I think it is, so disregard what I just said. Okay? So there's your 038 Magnum. Now, here's your 272. Husqvarna went narrower, okay? And not deeper. So, right there, I'm gonna give the gold standard to the 038 Magnum. The 038 Magnum has just way wider transfers. Look at that. Okay? Way wider. And they're a little bit deeper into here. Okay? So we're physically going to get more airflow through this stock than this. Now, you guys have seen me port these. I will often widen them and lower them, sometimes all the way to the bottom. I've been asked many times, why don't you just cut these all the way to the bottom? Well, every saw I build is going to be a little different. It depends on who's going to be running it. Okay? In a production setting, okay, if I cut this out here, everything below the piston is case capacity. If I completely cut these out, and I do sometimes, I need to add a large amount of intake timing. Okay? What's that going to do? Well, it's going to make the saw burn more fuel. So if a guy is doing full-on production work, I don't want 160 plus degrees of intake timing to really take care of all that extra bottom end. We want to make sure we can fill it. Well, if I do that kind of intake timing, the saw is going to be a fuel hog. Now, some guys, that's important. If you're walking into a site and you got to carry your fuel, you want to carry the least amount of fuel you can. So that's why often for just a general, work saw, I will simply just round these out. Okay. So there's a little question answered. So stock for stock, I'm giving the thumbs up to the 038. It's got bigger lower transfers. Uppers are exactly the same. Okay. There really is no difference in the upper transfers. Let's look at the exhaust port now. Hopefully you guys can see in there. I haven't cleaned this yet. I wasn't even sure if I was going to use it. Nice oval shape. Fairly wide, but not too wide. Okay. There you go. Now remember, this opens later. Interesting, isn't it? This has a relatively small exhaust port. It's narrow. and pretty flat at the top. So this one will open right across the top of it. This one cracks in the center. Now I prefer, and again, just how I do things, I like my exhaust ports to be D-shaped. Just gonna grab a marker here. I like my exhaust ports to be more like that at the top, because when the rings enter, they slowly enter and slowly exit the exhaust port. Also, when your max flow is happening, if this is your exhaust port here, friends, okay, and your piston is traveling around, there's your exhaust port. This is your cylinder here. If that cracks in the middle, that's going to create high pressure in that small spot. Think of if you poke a small hole in a tire versus a big hole. So I think, in my opinion, I think it's better to have a little bit more of a D shape. Also, if your exhaust port is shaped like this, that's easier on the rings. The saw should last longer. Ready? If this is your cylinder here, friends, okay, and this is your piston, it's supported here and here. The wider you make this, the less support here and here. That's going to wear rings and pistons quicker, okay? So, again, better exhaust port, in my opinion. This one, I like this exhaust port because it's slightly bigger. It's going to flow better out of the box. This one leaves me more room to port, so I like this one for porting. But we're talking stock for stock. So again, friends, I think the 038 Magnum just is a better design, and that's why it makes a little more grunt. But why is it slower? Well, right there, in my opinion. Look at the combustion chamber shape. It's really small. This is going to make a bunch of compression. Okay? Compression can slow a saw down on the way up. Not on the way down, though. Okay? So that's why, in my opinion, if you have a high compression saw, sometimes you're going to want shorter blowdown, because as the compression is pushing it down, it's nicer to get the cycle started again on a high compression saw, right? So you're not forcing the piston up with a lot of force because of the high compression, and then down with a lot of force because the transfer is open. Huge combustion chamber, very large. It's shaped like half a golf ball. This saw is not going to make as much compression as this saw. It just won't. Look at the size difference. I think that right there is the reason why these make more power. Okay, stock for stock. I'm going to raise the exhaust port on this saw probably 2 degrees. It's at 100 now. I'm going to drop it and do a base gasket delete, which should tighten our squish a little bit, and then I'm going to raise the exhaust back up to about 99, 100. Okay, that'll make this saw faster, and it'll also maintain a lot of that torque in the cut, because again, we're going to make a lot of compression. This saw with a pop-up would probably be incredible, but this isn't my saw, and it's up to me to build a saw for the people running it. So right there, I think this is a better cylinder than this. Ported, these run strong, but I'll bet you that this will run stronger. The difference is, though, friends, this weighs like 2 pounds more than this. I would rather swing this around with a little less power all day. If I'm just bucking up a log, I'd rather run this. So the reason why I got rid of my 038, it was too heavy for what it was. Great saw, loved it, super reliable, but too heavy. Let's move on to the intake and the carburetor. Okay, now, I think one of the major differences, here's your intake for your 038 Magnum. This hurts this saw. The air has to go down here, hit this corner around, okay? And look at that, friends. That is super, super stifled there, okay? So I have a feeling that that is one of the reasons why this saw just doesn't pull huge RPM versus this. This is what the 272 has. Wide open. It's probably 15-20% bigger, which is a lot. Okay, and then here's your cylinder side. Here's your carb side. Again, look at the difference. This is where the carb bolts up here, and this is where the carb bolts up here. Look at the difference in size, friends. That's a lot. I'm sorry, I flipped this around. There's where they bolt up. Again, this is big, but look at the size difference. Way more air going through a 272 than an 038. And now, here's the next problem. Okay, look at your big carburetor. It's blocked on the side here and the bottom. Tiny wee venturi. Here's the carb on a 272. Okay, this saw is going to make torque just because of the way the intake is set up. This saw could scream, and they do. You guys have seen me build a few saws. That 272 I built for buck and screams. Okay, and the way it does that is you can feed it more air at high RPM. Therefore, the potential is greater to be able to fuel it at high RPM. Now, pistons. Another reason. This piston is way, way heavier than this piston. 2 rings, 1 ring. Look at the size of the windows. Again, this saw is going to flow more air, the 272, than the 038. Nothing wrong with this, but, okay. In the future, I'm going to find a 038 Super or Magnum for me, and I want to put this piston in this saw. You can feel it. This piston feels heavier than this one. My gram scale is frozen, so. But really one of the main things, friends, is the ring. Single ring, double ring, less parasitic drag, more. That right there is gonna hamper how much RPM the saw can sustain or get up to. So stock, ported, we can play with that. But there you guys go. Interesting. So 2 completely different saws with the same bore and stroke, and they run completely different. Okay, well, I hope that was slightly helpful to you guys out there. I've been getting a lot of good questions lately. Sometimes I fast track over things just because of the fact I take for granted sometimes that things that I know, you guys know, and a lot of times you guys ask me, and it's like, okay. So right away, friends, even though this saw has bigger transfers, it's really, really held back by this intake design. And again, I'm sure we could open some of this up, but I don't think that's going to matter because the intake on this is so tiny that even if we open it up, it's just going to hit a wall and bounce back. So there are limitations to this design. I'm sure this thing will rock and roll ported, but you have to take into consideration your design limitations and what do you want to build. Not every saw is good as a hot saw. You know, the number one saw that I get asked about is that XL76 I did on the channel. That saw was not built for longevity. That saw was purely smiles per mile, and I think it's more than come through on that. But I wouldn't build a saw like that for production. They run hot, they can be picky to tune, and no dull chains. You run a saw like that with dull chain, that saw stock was 10K. I think it's in the 16s now. You know, in the cut, it's probably cutting 4,000 RPM more than stock. If you had a dull chain, you might be 6,000. I'll bet you money that thing would burn down pretty quick. So, I like just nicely warmed up work saws that are easy to tune, easy to start. That's what I want to run. So, both of these are a good candidate for a build like that. So, kind of interesting. I hope you guys got something out of this, and both good saws. They run different, but there are reasons. This one just flows more air. It's got a better piston design, lighter, single ring, bigger carburetor. This is always going to be a higher RPM saw because it's not held back. This one's always going to make more torque. Anyhow, friends, thanks for watching. Take her easy. Later.